Tēnā koutou. So I'm going to give you a talk today about a sort of a dashboard for your lives, and I am speaking to you as climate strikers or people who are assisting climate strikers. So this is going to be about those crises that Ian White talked about that intersect. Ko Cherokee te iwi, ko Chesapeake te awa, ko Musawak te maunga. I grew up in a land far away, but with relevance to bringing solutions to some big environmental problems. To you, I learned to be a scientist along the path. Like many scientists, I fly a bit too much, but I do many other things that are good. Here's where I've lived in New Zealand, and if that movie plays, that's going to show you the path I used to drive to get to work where the Wellington CO2 record started. And it reminds me how fragile and vulnerable, but visionary we are as New Zealanders, doesn't it? Look at these waves breaking across the windshield on my way to work in Eastbourne and Wellington Harbour. 30 years ago, I was in your place. 30 years ago, we had the Iron Curtain falling, and there was nothing left to do for those of us who were trained to fight communism, but to work on the environment. And 30 years later, we have twice as much carbon in the atmosphere, and I have a school striker daughter. What about your path, right? That's the big question. And for you, a lot of that comes down to identity. Who are you? Your generation, climate change, and other global issues, and what makes you unique as a New Zealander. So we're going to focus on the economy, agriculture, and aspects of the environment around climate and water that are going to matter to you. Now we're just going to focus on the economy for a second here. This is a picture of New Zealand's economy, and what's blinking on here is where we decided we should worry most about climate change. That means the sheep and beef sector because it's more sensitive, and it means sectors that are smaller but are trying to grow and respond to climate change, like arable, like wine, for example. That's where we did a lot of national work. Let's just talk about two climate change scenarios. So there's two maps of precipitation up here, two different GCMs, and this is what drove us to focus. Dairy responses are different from sheep and beef responses. So here you can see how bad it can be if we have low rainfall, and particularly even in the Waikato. Let's focus a bit more on that, but let's understand that averages are foggy. What we need to understand is variability, and ice cores tell us to worry a lot about variability because we are arriving at the end of the 9,000 years of most stable climate in the development of the Earth, where we've developed civilization and agriculture as we know it. So we have ranges in terms of what we see in pasture production. Mostly it's good, we grow more grass. But then let's look at the bottom of those plots, where we start under extreme climate scenarios to see more frequent and more extreme drought. And that's what we worry about hammering farms more and more. And even in the Waikato, under extreme climate, we see that turning down at the end of that last plot. It's even worse in hard hill country, say in Hawke's Bay, where we can see that some of these blinking lights that come on here show major declines in productivity and worse seasonality that's going to be hard to adapt to, particularly at the end of the century. Winter, on the other hand, is a little bit nicer. Now let's focus on the Waikato again here. So this is what we have more or less now, mid-century and end of century. And what you see in the mid-century and end of century is those dry summers popping up more and more, where we're not able to do what the Waikato has done well as sort of the dairying region that just fits for what it is. That leads to us to wonder, should we be thinking about ourselves as be shifting to the types of cropping systems or precision agriculture that occupies the whole rest of the world and produces the rest of the world's food? And the answer is maybe, and we could get a few different things from that, or we can mix it in with the systems that we already have. One way to think about that is if we think about cropping systems as having an opportunity to catch more, they come across, they'll start 2 weeks earlier, but they're also going to spread and have a lot more variability as we go into the future. And so what we need to think about is being able to deal with that variability. But can we use it to our advantage? So here's a spray of options of what it actually looks like in the future if we use catch crops. So these are crops that actually are designed to catch the nutrients that are in soil at a particular time we worry about losing them. Like, let's say all those terrible videos we've seen of winter cropping in Southland. In the future, we can actually see a broader spray that gives us more options there. and gives us options to start thinking about how we can turn this around and not grow more and not put more CO2 in the atmosphere, but actually do more to pull things back together. Because, as Blair already highlighted, there's a disproportionate amount of emissions from the proportion of GDP that comes from agriculture in New Zealand. If we have many problems, the best thing we can come up with is one solution. And I was amazed last week to see that this article I wrote went viral. It might have been because of the lambs, they're pretty cute. But I think that the answer is that it's actually because it helps to define regenerative agriculture for people. It helps to define something that people think is a buzzword, but it actually starts to look like a solution. What it is a circular economy. It's like recycling that makes sense to everybody. Let's actually put less in and then lose less. We'll probably make more profit along the way. We'll lose less greenhouse gases. We'll have less nutrients polluting water. We're going to close the loops in the system. But to do that, we actually have to redesign how we think about our agricultural systems. So and that leads us, in terms of doing that, to think about who's going to invest in this and how do we pay for it. What we already know about my generation, the generation after me, is there's an increasing likelihood of your generation of wanting to pay for sustainable products. There's an increasing likelihood in Australasia, and there's an increasing likelihood of investors wanting to back this. That's exciting. The other side, though, is that it's all about choices that you're making, and particularly if you're still officially a child, one thing to keep in mind is that you still have rights. And so we actually have professors at the university that talk about how your rights, not just to protest, but to make decisions that actually affect you and be involved in those, actually matter. So when you're thinking about this, you might want to think about some of the rules that exist in the world and whether they are actually really good rules. Don't break any laws or anything, but think about the rules that you haven't questioned, and think about whether you should question them, whether you should do things a little differently. Try not to crash. So it's your path, it's your planet, and these are your choices. Influence your family, choose for yourself, and think about the areas around you. Think about your diet and transport. So I do fly too much, but I'm a vegetarian for 20 years. I have an electric car. Inform yourself, inform others. Make requests, make demands. Thanks.